You are standing in a grocery line. It's 1989. You have a paycheck in your hand that you earned an hour ago. You are sweating. Why? Because you are in a race against a silent killer. Every minute you stand in this line, your money is dying. The milk in your cart just went up 12%. The bread, 15%. You watch a clerk running down the aisle with a sticker gun, slapping new, higher prices on cans you haven't even picked up yet. If the cashier takes a bathroom break, your family doesn't eat tonight. This isn't a war zone. This is Brazil, the only country in history to suffer from schizophrenic economics. We are talking about a superpower that accidentally built a trap for itself. A land with more arable land than the United States, more oil than the Gulf, and more fresh water than anywhere on Earth. A nation that God seemingly designed to be the greatest empire on the planet. By all laws of the universe, Brazil should rule the world. But instead of a superpower, we got a tragedy. So why is it that every time this giant tries to take off, it faceplants? Why is the country of the future always stuck in the past? Today, we dissect the curse. First, we need to kill a myth. You've been told Brazil is geographically blessed. You've been lied to. If you look at the United States, it's a logistics cheat code. They have the Mississippi River, a giant free conveyor belt that lets a farmer in Iowa float his corn to the ocean for pennies. It is the greatest economic asset on the planet. Brazil. Brazil got the opposite. Brazil got a fortress. It's called the Great Escarpment, a massive 2,000-foot wall of rock that runs along the coast, effectively cutting the ocean off from the interior. While American settlers were floating down lazy rivers, Brazilian settlers had to climb a vertical wall just to get a bag of coffee to a boat. And what about the Amazon? Isn't that a giant river? Sure. But it's in the wrong place. It's thousands of miles away from the mines and the farms, surrounded by a jungle so dense it eats bulldozers for breakfast. The Amazon isn't a highway, it's a green prison. This geography didn't just make transport expensive, it broke the psychology of the nation before it even started. When the Portuguese arrived in 1500, they took one look at that massive wall of rock and made a decision that is still ruining the country 5 centuries later. They decided, we aren't going in there. They became crabs. That's what the early historians called them. Crabs scratching at the coastline, refusing to enter the vast interior. This created the extraction mindset. The Portuguese didn't look at Brazil and see a home to build like the British did in America. They saw a giant open-air warehouse. The goal wasn't to build a nation. The goal was to loot the warehouse and go back to Lisbon. They built archipelagos, isolated economic islands. A sugar island in the north, a gold island in the south. None of them connected. No roads, no trade. Just a bunch of separate businesses pretending to be a country. But a loose collection of businesses can't survive without a manager. And that is where the tragedy shifts from geography to bureaucracy. In 1808, something happened that had never happened in history. A European king, terrified of Napoleon Bonaparte, packed up his entire court and fled to his colony. Dom Juan VI didn't just bring his family, he brought 15,000 professional bureaucrats, dukes, judges, tax collectors, and stamp lickers. He took the bloated, slow, expensive government of old Europe and dropped it right into the middle of the Rio jungle. They weren't there to build infrastructure to climb the wall. They were there to tax the people who did. The company finally had a CEO, and he was about to create a monster that not even the jungle could kill. So you have a massive, expensive European court living in a tropical swamp. How do you pay for the powdered wigs, the bureaucracy, and the imported wine? You don't build industries. You don't innovate. You look at the ground and pray. And in the 1690s, the ground answered. They found gold, not just a little bit. We are talking about the largest gold discovery the world had ever seen up to that point. For the next 100 years, Brazil wasn't a country. It was a global ATM machine. This is where the vampire economy was born. In North America, settlers were forced to farm, trade, and build workshops just to survive. They had to build value from scratch. In Brazil, they just dug holes. It is the classic lottery winner syndrome. Why would you bother learning math or engineering or manufacturing when you can just stick a shovel in the dirt and pull out a fortune? While the rest of the world was preparing for the Industrial Revolution, Brazil was on a spending spree. They didn't build universities, they built palaces. They didn't build factories, they built churches covered in gold leaf so thick it would make a modern billionaire blush. They were importing everything. Even the shovels used to dig the gold were made in England. The wealth flowed out of the mines, onto the ships, and straight into London banks, leaving Brazil with nothing but holes in the ground and a very fancy, very corrupt elite who had no idea how to run a real economy. But geology is a cruel mistress. In the late 1700s, the impossible happened. The miners dug down and found dirt. Just dirt. The veins were tapped out. The party was over. The music stopped, but the massive bloated government was still there, waiting for its paycheck. Panic set in. The vampire was starving. The country was on the verge of total collapse, sitting in the ruins of its own extravagance with no backup plan. They needed a fix. They needed a new commodity to inject into the system. They needed a miracle, and they found it growing on a shrub in the hills of Rio. A small red berry that was about to hook the entire world. Coffee. If gold was a narcotic, coffee was pure adrenaline. By the late 1800s, Brazil wasn't just participating in the global coffee market, they were the market. They produced so much caffeine that if Brazil had a bad harvest, breakfast in New York got more expensive. But this wealth created a political mutation known as café com leite, coffee with milk. The presidency didn't belong to the people. It was time-shared between the coffee barons of São Paulo and the dairy tycoons of Minas Gerais. The government wasn't running the economy was running the government, and like all monopolies, they got greedy. They planted so many trees that they broke the fundamental law of supply and demand. They produced mountains of beans that the world simply didn't want. In a normal country, prices would crash and farmers would go bust. But in Brazil, failure is just a negotiation. The oligarchs decided that if the market wouldn't pay high prices, the government would force it to. They invented valorization. It sounds like a complex economic term, but it was actually the most insane bailout in history. The government took out massive foreign loans to buy their own coffee at inflated prices just to store it in warehouses. But the harvest kept coming. The warehouses overflowed. So they did the unthinkable. They didn't sell it cheap. They didn't give it to the poor. They set it on fire. For years, steam trains in Brazil didn't run on coal. They ran on coffee beans. The government was literally shoveling the nation's wealth into a furnace to keep the heat up. Millions of bags worth billions of dollars turned to ash and smoke, all to protect the profit margins of a dozen families. It was an economic suicide pact, masquerading as policy. They incinerated billions of dollars of wealth just to keep the price of a latte high. If you think that is a crime against economics, hit the like button. It's the only thing in this story that creates value instead of destroying it. And it worked right up until the day the music stopped for everyone. In 1929, the American stock market jumped out of a window. The United States, the biggest buyer of all that caffeine, went broke overnight. The demand hit zero. The Brazilian house of cards, built on debt and burnt beans, collapsed instantly. The coffee barons looked around for a lifeline, but this time, nobody was coming to save them. The era of the oligarchs was dead in the water. From the ashes of the coffee fields, a short cigar-smoking gaucho named Getulio Vargas stepped off a train and seized power. He looked at the ruins of the agrarian empire and made a bold promise. He said Brazil was done digging and farming. He declared the Estado Novo, the new state. He promised to turn this farm into a factory. He was going to industrialize Brazil by force. It sounded like salvation. It sounded like the future. But in reality, Vargas was about to construct a bureaucratic monster so complex that it would eventually eat its own children. Vargas set the stage, but the generals who took over in 1964 wanted a show. They didn't just want a new state, they wanted a superpower, and they were willing to mortgage the entire future to get it. For a brief shining moment in the early 70s, Brazil looked like the next China. The economy wasn't just growing, it was exploding. 10% growth year after year. Skyscrapers popped up in São Paulo like weeds. They built the Itaipu Dam, a concrete beast so big it provided electricity for the entire nation. They carved the Trans-Amazonian Highway through the densest jungle on the planet, a road that went from nowhere to nowhere, just to prove they could conquer nature itself. It looked like the curse was finally broken. But nobody bothered to read the fine print. This entire party was being paid for with a national credit card. The generals were borrowing billions of dollars from foreign banks, drowning the country in cheap loans to fund these pharaoh-like monuments. It was the geopolitical equivalent of buying a Ferrari on a minimum wage salary, because the bank sent you a pre-approved offer. Everyone was drinking the champagne, cheering the Great Brazil, and ignoring the quiet guy in the corner tallying up the tab. Then, the 1980s kicked down the door. In Washington, the United States raised interest rates to kill their own inflation. It was a cold, calculated move, and it snapped Brazil's neck. Since all those billions in loans had variable interest rates, the debt payments didn't just double, they skyrocketed. The bill for the party arrived in the mail, and the account was empty. The miracle vanished faster than smoke. The factories slowed down, the jobs evaporated. The generals, realizing the game was up, slowly backed out of the room, handing the keys back to a civilian government just as the house caught fire. Brazil was bankrupt, humiliated, and alone. But the worst part wasn't the poverty. It was the monster that crawled out of the wreckage to feed on the remains. The dragon of inflation was born, and it was hungry. The miracle rotted into a nightmare called the lost decade. Inflation stopped crawling and started sprinting. We aren't talking about rising prices. We're talking about the destruction of value itself, 2,500%. Money became ice in the desert. The supermarket transformed from a grocery store into a combat zone. A specific job title emerged from this chaos, the remarkador. Men armed with sticker guns ran down the aisles, slapping new price tags on cans of beans while customers were still reaching for them. You had to physically outrun the inflation. Grab the milk before the sticker gun clicked, and you could afford dinner. Hesitate, and you went hungry. Payday was a scene of mass hysteria. The moment the deposit hit, entire offices emptied out. Workers raced to the bank to dump their cash into the overnight, a specialized account that paid interest daily. It was the only way to stop your salary from evaporating. Holding physical cash for 24 hours was financial suicide. Desperate to stop the bleeding, the government tried to outlaw the laws of economics. President José Sarney appeared on television and declared a total price freeze. He deputized the entire population, telling citizens to arrest anyone charging too much. It turned neighbors into informants. Grandmothers called the police on butchers because ground beef went up by a cruzeiro. Police raided warehouses, confiscating eggs and hiding cattle. The shelves went bare. You had pockets full of cash, but nothing to buy. When force failed, they tried confusing the math. They cut 3 zeros off the banknotes. The cruzeiro became the cruzado. When that collapsed, they cut 3 more zeros and printed the Cruzado Novo. Then they went back to the Cruzeiro. In 10 years, the currency changed names 5 times. The money in your wallet looked like Monopoly cash, and it held about as much value. By 1993, the state was paralyzed. The poor were scavenging, the middle class was vanishing, and the wealthy had moved their assets to Miami. The generals had failed. The politicians had failed. The country was drifting toward total social collapse. But in a quiet university office in Rio, a small team of sociologists and philosophers was watching the fire burn. They weren't the typical bank suits. They drank whiskey, debated Marx and Weber, and realized everyone else had missed the point. The problem wasn't mathematical anymore. It was a hallucination. They hatched a plan that sounded insane. They weren't going to fix the economy with interest rates. They were going to save Brazil with a psychological magic trick. The team of academics knew that printing another banknote with a new hero's face on it would fail. The trust was gone. Brazilians saw a price tag and panic set in. To fix the economy, The government had to break that Pavlovian response. They created the URV, the unit of real value. It was a currency that didn't exist. You couldn't hold it. You couldn't withdraw it. It was a ghost. Shopkeepers were told to list prices in URVs. Milk cost 1 URV, bread cost half a URV, but when you opened your wallet, you still had the old rotting cruceros. You paid in cruceros based on a daily exchange rate printed in the newspaper. On Monday, 1 URV was 100 cruceros. On Tuesday, it was 105. The price on the shelf stayed the same. The money in your hand changed. It forced 150 million people to separate the idea of value from the cash in their pocket. For months, the entire country practiced this economic role-play. They got used to seeing stable numbers again. The fever broke. On July 1st, 1994, the government turned the ghost into flesh. The URV became the real. The old money was incinerated. Inflation crashed into a wall. It went from nearly 50% a month to single digits. A cleaner could finally buy a chicken, and no, it would cost the same next week. A construction worker could buy a television on an installment plan. Fernando Henrique Cardoso, the sociologist behind the gamble, rode the victory straight to the presidency. With a stable currency, the ground was fertile for the next stroke of luck. Just as Brazil got its house in order, a hungry giant woke up on the other side of the world. China needed soy, they needed iron, they needed oil, and they were willing to pay top dollar for all of it. Brazil entered a golden age. Under President Lula, the economy soared. They paid off foreign debt. Millions were lifted out of poverty. The cover of The Economist showed the Christ the Redeemer statue taking off like a rocket ship. The world declared that the sleeping giant had finally awakened. But the celebration masked a critical error. While the money was flowing in, nobody looked at the pipes. The government spent the windfall on consumption and credit, not on fixing the engine. The insane tax code remained. The crumbling infrastructure remained. The judicial nightmare remained. They had painted over a rusted hull with gold paint. The ship looked magnificent, shimmering in the sun, but the structural rot underneath hadn't been touched. And when the Chinese appetite eventually slowed down, the paint would begin to peel, revealing that the country of the future was still trapped in the same old cage. Economists have a cruel name for what happened next. They call it a chicken flight. A chicken can fly. It flaps its wings, lifts off the ground, and for a few glorious seconds it looks like it's soaring. But a chicken is not an eagle. It doesn't have the anatomy for sustained altitude. Gravity always wins. The bird comes crashing down, usually into the mud. That is the Brazilian economy. Every boom is just a chicken jumping, mistaken for an eagle rising. The crash began at a nondescript gas station in Brasilia. Federal police were investigating a small money laundering ring. They pulled a thread, and the entire fabric of the nation unraveled. This was Operação Lava Jato, Operation Car Wash. It wasn't just a scandal, it was an autopsy of the political system. Investigators discovered that the state-run oil company, Petrobras, was essentially a bribery engine. Construction giants were overcharging for refineries and kicking billions back to politicians. The very people claiming to build the country of the future were looting the treasury to buy yachts and silence witnesses. When the truth came out, the economy didn't just stumble. It contracted by 7% in 2 years. It was a depression deeper than the 1929 crash was for the United States. The golden era of the 2000s vanished, revealing that the growth had been lubricated by fraud. But corruption is just the headline. The real killer, the silent assassin that keeps the country grounded, is much more boring and much more lethal. It is called the Custo Brasil, the cost of Brazil. It is the invisible price you pay just for existing in this geography. The centerpiece of this nightmare is the tax code. In the United States, a medium-sized company spends about 175 hours a year preparing and paying taxes. In Brazil, that same company spends nearly 2,000 hours. That is not a typo. Brazilian businesses need an entire department just to figure out how to pay the government. The tax rules change practically every day. There are thousands of pages of regulations that contradict each other. You can follow the law perfectly on Monday and be a criminal by Tuesday, because a bureaucrat in Rio changed a semicolon in a PDF. This bureaucratic maze acts like a massive invisible wall. It destroys productivity. Instead of designing better products or hiring more staff, entrepreneurs burn their capital on lawyers and accountants. It creates a rigged game. The only companies that can survive this custo Brazil are the massive old giants, the ones with the money to hire armies of tax lawyers and the connections to get special favors in Brasilia. The small startup, the innovator in a garage, they die before they can even file their first return. A Brazilian CEO wastes 2,000 hours a year on bureaucracy. You can make a smart business decision in just 2 seconds right now. Subscribe to the channel. It's the highest return on investment you will get all day. The system is designed to protect the old and kill the new. It turns the economy into a closed club where efficiency is punished and bureaucracy is king. And until this invisible wall is torn down, the chicken will never stay in the air. This brings us back to the central tragedy. Brazil is not a poor country. It is an incredibly rich country full of poor people. And that distinction matters. The abundance of natural wealth, the very thing that should have made Brazil a superpower, became its cage. When you can just dig gold out of the ground, or watch coffee grow on trees, or drill oil from the ocean floor, you don't feel the pressure to educate your population. You don't feel the urgent need to build efficient factories or honest courts. You rely on the lottery ticket. This is the golden handcuffs. The easy wealth allowed the state to become bloated, arrogant, and detached from reality. Nations with zero resources like Japan or Switzerland were forced to invest in their people because human brains were the only asset they had. Brazil never had that gun to its head, so it never built the institutions required to pull the trigger on true development. There is a famous haunting joke that every Brazilian knows. Brazil is the country of the future, and it always will be. That phrase isn't a promise, it is a curse. It implies that the potential is always there, visible, tantalizing, but eternally out of reach. The future in Brazil is like the horizon line. You can see it. It looks beautiful. But no matter how fast you run toward it, it remains exactly the same distance. Away. Every boom cycle, the gold, the rubber, the coffee, the soy, is just the country sprinting toward that horizon, only to collapse from exhaustion before getting there. Can they break the loop? Can the giant finally stop stumbling? The answer isn't in finding more oil or discovering a new mineral. The answer is boring. It requires smashing the custo Brazil. It requires tearing down the bureaucratic wall that protects the corrupt and stifles the brilliant. It requires a shift from an economy of extraction to an economy of innovation. Until they decide to stop digging for buried treasure and start building a functional society, the country of the future will remain a prisoner of its past. History doesn't repeat itself, but in Brazil, it definitely rhymes. The geography that trapped Brazil is unique, but geography can also be a shield. While Brazil's terrain locked it in, another superpower used its geography to become untouchable. In the next video, we are going to look at the other side of the coin. We are breaking down why the United States is impossible to invade. If you want to understand who wins and who loses in the global economic war, you need to be here for that. Subscribe now. We are tracking the winners, and you don't want to be on the losing side.